So I'm Fred Catlin again, the head of the school. And what I want to do today is kind of talk a little bit about really some thoughts on the 21st century skills, what they are and how they affect your children, or more accurately, how they affect you as you have to raise your kids. How to help you to parent to support these skill sets that your child has. And also to help you understand the educational environment that's going to support the development of those skills. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of breeze along, but if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'm more than happy to stop and talk about something briefly. I don't want to get too long sidetracked, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions that people have. There is a handout. I hope everybody got it in the back, that yellow sheet of paper. It really gives kind of an overview of what I'm saying. So let's start with one of the things that we're struggling with as parents nowadays. And most of our kids and most of us, when we went through education, we were educated for the 20th century. And the 20th century was an educational process that really was led by a gentleman named John Dewey, who we know through the Dewey Decimal System for library. John Dewey was really the star of the Columbia University School of Education, and he devised the great American educational method in the early part of the 20th century. And what he devised with his colleagues was an educational system that fit the needs of the 20th century. And what you had in the United States is you had a country that was on the cusp of, or actually it was already emerging as a manufacturing powerhouse. And in manufacturing, you had already had Henry Ford create the production line, and there was a need to have people who were educated to be able to work in that kind of environment. So what you needed to have is the management structure was a very hierarchical top-down structure. So you needed to have people who would obey instructions and directions very clearly and precisely. You needed to have people who were used to doing rote activities, because that's part of what you do when you work on a production line. Even if you were a manager, you still had a rote activity that you had to do. It was the same thing day in, day out that you had to do. You also had to learn a vast array of facts that weren't necessarily interrelated, but you need to show that you were knowledgeable. And in fact, when you got a liberal arts degree, and most of us are of the age when you got a liberal arts degree, you had no guarantee of a job, which was very frustrating when you saw all those engineers graduate and get jobs coming out of college. What they said is that you were now learned. You were now had the capacity to be teachable. So that when you went into the corporate world, they would know how to train you appropriately. And that's because you would learn to take in facts and then be able to regurgitate them. And that's part of, again, setting you up for 20th century skills. The other part was that you worked as an individual towards the greater collective goal. So you had your individual task, and your task was added to the task of another individual, and so on and so forth, until you achieved the great corporate goal. And that's how the educational system has been designed in this country. And it worked really well until we got through about the 1960s. And you'll notice that at that point, it starts failing us. And it's failed this country because we're not preparing our kids for what they're going to face in the 21st century. And the best way that I can give you a sense of what you're going to face in the 21st century is to bring up some images that are going to be very familiar to you that your child has no concept of. Floppy disks, cassettes, dials. You know, like a radio dial? No concept of that, right? Because they don't have them. I'm a little bit older. I remember dials on TV sets, and most of you don't even have a concept of that because you're used to remotes. But dials are pretty much gone. The last thing, I can tell someone who is a younger person versus an older person as to whether they wear a wristwatch or not. Because the younger people don't wear wristwatches anymore because they have a phone, and the phone's got a wristwatch on it. In fact, I read recently that email will probably disappear in the next 10 years. and it will be replaced by Facebook or some other social media form. It is a completely different world. Now, of course, I'm a little bit older, and I can talk about 8-tracks, and most of you have no idea what I'm talking about. But that's the nature of what's happening. And for these kids, that 21st century skill, or 21st century world that they're looking at is completely different than the world that we were familiar with. And all those base things that we knew of have already disappeared and changed for our kids. So it's a completely different environment. So what does the 21st century world look like? It's going to be, Thomas Friedman wrote a book that was called The World is Flat, A Brief History of the 21st Century. And there are some things that he didn't get right, but one of the things that he did say that I think is right is that the world is going to be a much more smaller, more interconnected world than it has been, that there's going to be, the technology will allow you to communicate. You're already seeing it with Skype and other programs like that, to be able to communicate anywhere with anyone in the world. You're going to find that technology will make information much more accessible. So there is no need to learn all these diverse facts and figures, because your child will pull out their phone and they will go boop, 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 and they'll get the information much more quickly than we were able to access that information. And so you're going to be looking at different kinds of students in the 21st century because they have such access to that information. You're also going to find there is a decline in the professional person and more of an increase in the need for generalists. One of the things that's kind of frightening in the world is that the United States, and I can't remember the precise numbers, Daniel Pink wrote a great book called A Whole New Mind. Daniel Pink was an economics person, I think, at Harvard, and now he's had success with a couple of bestsellers, so he doesn't do that anymore. But one of the things that he did in his economic research is he said, you know, the United States generates X number, say 3,000 engineers a year from its colleges. And he said between China and India, they are cranking out about 50 times that number. And they're going to be able to demand lower salaries or require lower salaries than what happens in the United States. Now, if that means you're an engineer, you don't need to jump out the window because it's all over. But you do need to understand for your children that there is a completely different world that's coming upon them. And that what happens is having that specific narrow skill is going to be less critical going into the 21st century than it was for you when you were growing up to have that specific skill. The other thing that you'll find is the development of diverse and divergent teams that will be spanning countries, spanning cultures, spanning languages, and you'll have devices that will interpret language so that everyone can communicate with each other. So there will be a lot more of this collaborative type work, project teams getting together, and you're starting to see that now. Margaret Wheatley wrote a book about management is the new science. And what she was talking about there is the fact that you're going to have corporations that will pull a group of people together to work on this project. When that project finishes, they'll disperse the people and they'll go work on other projects, and so on and so forth. So it's a very collaborative, project-based environment that you're going to see in the 21st century. And you're already seeing this. If you go to Google, if you go to HP, if you go to any of these kind of corporations that are on the front edge of what's going on, that's the way they operate nowadays. They don't have this person having their own little individual work and then another person is doing this and somehow they're merged together. Remember, that's the 20th century model, not the 21st century model. The other thing that you'll find is that older economies like us are going to have to rely on innovation. And it's going to be what allows us to have success going into the 21st century as a country. So that's a little bit about what's happening in that brave new world that's happening out there, which is very frightening because it's completely different. But again, I've already shattered your world by telling you that floppy disks and cassettes are something that your children have no concept of. So out of the research that has been happening over the last 20 years, they've looked at all the different educational methods and how best to serve your child going into the 21st century. And they really have come up with 5 things that seem to be the best. And these came out from some well-renowned researchers, and their names were, if I can pull it, Bransford, Brown, and Cooking. They wrote a couple of books, and they're kind of at the front edge of pulling together all this information. They talk about 5 kind of learning styles, or 5 learning processes to use for the 21st century. The first one is what they called authentic learning. There's a great book written by a cognitive scientist by the name of Dan Willingham, whose book is called Why Children Don't Like School. And it's really a book for teachers to help them when they're struggling with kids who don't like school. And one of the main points he says in there is that learning happens best when it happens in context. And we as humans, if we have a contextual basis, we will learn the information. So one of the hints that people who help you with memory do is if you have to memorize a list of items, they have you take the first letter of each of those words and associate that with some memory or some word that you're familiar with, and that's putting it into a context. More broadly, what you would find in contextual learning is that instead of having one day you learn about Greece, and then the next day you'll learn about something else altogether, and you have one class that's Greeks, and one class where you're doing geometry, and one class where you're doing something another, you blend them all together into an integrated learning. And then you have the opportunity to learn about how the Greeks use geometry for their architecture and the philosophy that was involved in Greece. And all these things come together because when you're learning that philosophy, you're now learning it in the context of how it was presented, how the Greeks first developed philosophy, and so on and so forth. And the same with geometry and so on and so forth. So one of the things they're talking about is this need for authentic or contextual learning. The other that's very important is called mental model building. Mental model building means that you need to have an image, a mental image in your brain, and that will help you understand. I'm going to give you a quick lesson. I'm going to cause some people to perspire a little bit, but hold on, you'll be okay. I'm going to show something to you. So, some of you who have gone on tour may have seen this from me. So, at some point in our lives, we were given this and said we had to factor it down. And so you had to realize that that's the same as that. And then you had to realize you have to do all this equations, a times a times a, and a times plus a times b, and so on and so forth, until eventually you come down to here. Now, that caused many of us to have stunted growth, to have great issues in our lifetime. What we do in Montessori is if we say that this color blue, one side represents A, and here this color red, well, you can see red down here on the bottom, that represents B. Then this whole edge right along here is A plus B. And because this is a cube, trust me because you can't see it, it's A plus B on this side. So that's A plus B, or A times B, A plus B times A plus B. Okay? And we're going to go down one more. So that's A plus B times A plus B times A plus B. You're starting to see something here. Okay? What you have is A cubed. And you have A squared times B. And you've got 3 of them. You have 3b squared times A. And you have 3 of them. And you have B cubed. So now, whenever you're confronted by this in the future, you will never have a problem because you've seen that mental image in your mind about how that works. And you'll always know that if you ever had to break down, and heaven help that you ever have to, But if you ever had to do it, now you understand that you're basically talking about components of a cube that you're breaking down. And that's the purpose of this material, is to give the child a mental map of how that works. So the child has that mental, I'm going to put that away because I don't want to concern anyone. But the whole idea there is that you've created a mental image in the child's brain. And that's what happens with the Montessori materials. We create those mental images. We do it with division. We do it with multiplication. We do it with different parts of speech and how a sentence relates to one another. And those things, when they have those mental images, the child who says, oh, I'm terrible at math, I never do well at math, it's because they were never able to get that mental image of how division works. They never got the mental image of how multiplication works, or they never got the mental image of how fractions work. And this is what you need to have. You need to have these mental images because it'll help you become better in whatever you want to do. The third is that the third of the best ways to teach a child is for the child to be internally motivated. The gold stars, the little pieces of candy, all that works for just about the first couple of times. And then it's all about what is the candy I'm going to get, or what are the gold stars, and it's not about learning the knowledge that was the initial intent of why you want to do it. So as lawyers like to say, you're on a slippery slope when you start doing those external rewards, because it works wonderfully for dogs, it doesn't work for children. Because what happened is they're going to want to be focused more on the reward and not on what you're trying to accomplish. So what you want to do is you want to try to focus on intrinsic rewards or rewards. And the intrinsic reward is the child feeling a sense of accomplishment for what he does. So as a parent, how does this equate itself? So instead of, and we all do this, first of all, we need to understand that just like Jacob Marley and Dickens' story, you know, Jacob Marley walked around with a chain in death which had links for all the sins that he did. Well, each of us as parents have that, that mythical chain attached to us, and there's, each link is the guilt that we have for things that we screw up with our children. And we all have those. So I'm saying let's leave all those links at the door. Because one of the first things that we do as a parent is our child comes home with some scribbles on a piece of paper and says, look what I did. And what do? We say, whoa, what a wonderful job. That's so great. What happens, the child's now gotten this connection. Oh, I can just put some scribbles on paper. I get these really positive feedback from my parents. And what happens is that's not helping him develop the intrinsic motivation to want to continue to do that work. So what you should do as a parent, you reflect back and you say, wow, it looks like you put some work into that. What was the thing that made you most proud about doing that work? Or what was the best thing that you liked about doing that work? Those kinds of things are reflecting it back to the child. And the child then is developing that intrinsic motivation. The classic example of external motivation gone wrong is, now it's a bit dated, but about 10 or 15 years ago, the Philadelphia Phillies were in the World Series against somebody, and I can't remember whom. But the Philadelphia Phillies had the ace relief pitcher that year. And he came up and he blew 2 or 3 games in the World Series. By the end of the next year, he was out of baseball. Because what had happened is he was so acclimated to receiving the external adulation that when he had his first crisis, which was pitching a couple of really bad games, he was not able to have the internal fortitude, the internal structure, because he had never developed intrinsic motivation to be able to handle that. Isn't it terrible that we're using some guy who no one knows for this example? But it's such a classic example of what happens when you have too much focus on external motivation and not on intrinsic motivation. Kids want to learn. We are naturally curious. And what happens is that we need to make them reflect upon the benefit that they feel from learning that information. Let them show off to you what they've learned. That will make them feel good. Okay. The other is to have multiple learning approaches. Most of us know of Howard Gardner. who wrote the book Multiple Intelligences, which was really a landmark book. And it's true. Some of us are visual learners. Most of us are visual learners. But some of us are tactile learners. Some of us are kinetic learners. There are also, I think, another one's called mathematical learners. When I relax, I like to do puzzles. And that's what you have with a mathematical learner. My wife, poor woman, when she wants to relax, she needs to do busy work. That to her is relaxation. And so you understand that we as humans all have different kinds of ways that we find relaxation, we take in information and process and absorb it. And part of what you find is that you need to have an environment that allows for multiple intelligences to come in and use that information in the way that works best for them to absorb it into themselves. Okay. The final is social learning, learning through collaboration. You find that if you have a team that works together, and corporations have known this for 20 years, that if you have a group that's collaborating, there is an increase in motivation, an increase in retention of the information, an increase in innovative results that come out of it, and a byproduct is an increase in social or interpersonal skills of all the participants. So those are the 5: authentic or contextual learning, mental model building, intrinsic motivation, multiple learning approaches, and collaborative or social learning. Okay, so what are the 21st century skills? There's a great book. This was written by the, what do they call themselves? They call themselves the Partnership for 21st Century Skills. And the partnership was designed as a collaborative effort between the U.S. Government of Education, Department of Education, the National Educational Association, which is the teachers, Dell, Cisco Systems, Apple, Microsoft, HP, a number of other, probably 20 or 30 other innovative corporations, all came together and looked at what do we need to prepare people for the 21st century. And so a lot of these 21st century skills come out of this work, which is kind of their penultimate work that came out of the partnership. And what they talk about is they talk about 3 different areas. The first one is learning to learn and to innovate. And what they mean by that is that you need to have critical, one of the skills they're going to need is they're going to need to have critical thinking or problem solving skills. And what that means is you need to provide an environment for them where they don't just learn a set of information and then you test them on it. They need to learn some information and then they use that information to learn additional information. That's what is involved in developing problem solving and critical thinking skills. So a child begins working on something. He comes up against an obstacle. He then needs to use the information that he's just learned to help him get over this obstacle. He proceeds along further and learns things. He comes to another obstacle. He takes the information he has and applies it to what he's doing, and that moves him forward. That's problem solving, that's critical thinking. You do the same thing when you do a research paper. You're taking in information, you're having to process it before you submit it out or print it out or process it out into a paper. So that's a very critical skill that you need to have. And Montessori, the purpose of the trial and error materials like these is one of the ways that we help develop those problem solving skills. One of the things that you can do as a parent, and this requires extraordinary patience, which few of us, I'm right at the front of the group, have. Again, we've all left our chains at the door, is not to, a child will say, you know, Daddy, what's 2 + 4? I have to work very hard not to say 6 because we just want to get it out so fast. And I learned early on with my kids, I never answer a question with a fact. I always answered a question with a question. Well, Devin, what do you think the answer is? And it got to a point by the time he was about 12 or 14, when he became a teenager, and that's a whole nother discussion, that he said, Dad, why do you do that? every time I ask you something, you always ask me a question back. Right? And part of it is that's requiring him to do that critical thinking. So that's something that you can do as a parent, is constantly ask back to them, reflect it back to your child. And that's a way for them to develop those skills. Second of these kind of learning to learn and innovate is to be able to be communicative, to be able to be collaborative. And that means to develop what scientists now call high emotional intelligence. And high emotional intelligence is what we call interpersonal skills. The ability to look someone in the eye when you're talking to them, to be able to pick up the signals from their face, when someone's upset with you, to be able to know that. We call it instinctive. It's not instinctive. It means that you have high emotional intelligence. And it's interesting, Harvard did a recent study, and I can actually tell this from anecdotal, but Harvard did a study and they said the best indicator of future success is not cognitive intelligence, it's not environmental intelligence, it's emotional intelligence. And I know when I was earlier in my life, I was working at the University of Virginia with their alumni association. And the University of Virginia alumni of the 40s were by no means geniuses. It was not the Yale or the Harvard of the South back then. It was basically the school where you couldn't get your kid in anywhere else. You sent him to the University of Virginia. And I met all these alumni in the 70s and 80s, and these guys were all incredibly successful. They ran car dealerships. They were in sales. They did other things. They had extraordinary success. They could drink you under the table because they had these wonderful interpersonal skills. And yet they didn't have what is the typical formula of strong cognitive skills, because that emotional intelligence is very important. And that's one of the things that we work on very much here in the Montessori, to constantly build those. The crucible, the key time for the development of those is between 6 and 12 years of age. That's when your child is working really hard to develop those interpersonal skills. The child up to 6, God bless him, he's just really focused upon himself. But from 6 to 12, they're focused upon interaction with others, and it's also true from 12 to 18, but you also have all the baggage involved. But from 6 to 12 is the beginning of that time they're really trying to figure out who they are in relationship to everybody else. So please, please, after school is done, do not schedule something every night of the week for your child. Let them have 3 or 4 nights a week where they just hang out with the neighborhood kids, because that's when they're going to develop those interpersonal skills. They're going to see what you do, they're going to model what you do, and then they want to test it out. And they test it out with their friends. So it's vitally important for them. That's one of the most important skills that they will learn in their lifetime. I have competition. The third is to be able to be creative and be innovative. And again, that's reflecting the questions back. You're forcing the child to be able to have to think their way through on an answer. Okay? How are we doing? Okay, we're doing well. About 5-10 more minutes. The second set of skills, that's probably the most critical set, is learning how to learn and learning how to innovate. And again, it's critical thinking, problem-solving skills, it's being able to communicate and collaborate, and it's also having the ability to be creative and innovative. That right there is a very important set of skills for your children to have in the 21st century. The second is to have the digital literacy skills, to be able to work your way around a computer, essentially, and other technological devices that are coming along. And I will freely admit I am a dinosaur of the 20th century. And I have to just deal with that. My son, I now have gotten to the point with my son or my daughter, I hand anything electrical over to them, and they get it figured out in a heartbeat. I had my son figure out my phones every time I got a new phone, and he did it in about 10 minutes. And it would have taken me hours to figure it out, because he has that digital literacy that I don't have. And that literacy is basically information literacy. You know, when we were young and going to school, we had textbooks, and we had a certain limited amount of information that was constantly come to us. If you look at what you're facing now, the volume of information that we face every day is tenfold, 20-fold what it was 20 years ago. And your children now have to be able to process their way through that. And so one of the important skills is for them to develop the ability to access that information, to process that information, to evaluate the information that's useful and what's not, and to utilize it effectively, because it is an overwhelming amount. So what we do in a Montessori and what you can do is helping your child develop planning and organization. Now, your child up to the age of 6 is going to be the model of order and organization. All bets are off at about the age of 6, though, and your child will lose that sense of order. So your older one is right on the cusp now. So you talk to people who have elementary and they're constantly banging their head against the wall because their child loses their jacket or forgets their lunch or forgets their shoes or what have you. That's all right. That's the nature of the child from 6 to 12 into 18. Because the part of the brain that develops those skills doesn't get fully functional until about 15 to 18 years of age. So they don't have those organizational skills. So you have to help them develop it, help them develop lists, help them to, and again, as a parent, you can help them process, well, what are the things that you have to do in order to go over to Johnny's to spend the night? What are the things that you're going to have to do to prepare? And you're forcing your child to begin organizing and making a list that he has to follow. We do the same thing in a Montessori classroom with the 6 to 12-year-olds by helping them with a thing that we call the work journal that does the same kind of thing. And every time they're doing a research report or doing any other activity, we're forcing them, again, reflecting back to them, how are you going to deal with this? And that's an important skill that they can have to help them wade their way through this massive amount of technological information that comes their way every day. The other thing is you need to have media literacy. You need to know how computers and all these other means of technology work. And you need to be able to use them responsibly. And the third is information and communication technologies. You need to understand how these technologies work. And one of the greatest challenges that you will face, if you have not faced it so far, is things like Facebook. Because Facebook is a very important part of your child's life. If not yet, it will be in about 10 years. And the problem is it's also a very, very dangerous environment. And so you have to have a child who has developed an awareness and developed a sense of self-discipline and self-responsibility for using those materials carefully. Because there's all sorts of people lurking out on Facebook and through some of these other things that can do very bad things. And so you have to be able, as a child these days, to have the wherewithal to fully understand the consequences of your actions. And that's one of the most important challenges that we as parents face, that we have to deal with our kids as we go forward. And so every time that you give your child, even when it doesn't deal with technology, but every time you give your child the opportunity to take on responsibility, that's going to help them down the road when they have to face these issues of how do I set up my friends and so on and so forth in Facebook. That's all part of this thing. Now, I talked earlier about patience and I really didn't follow through. All of this reflecting back to the child, all of this asking questions of the child means that it takes longer to do everything than you would normally want it to take. And you have to build that in every time you work with your child. When you have a child under the age of 6, you automatically plan, or if you don't, you should, and this will help remove some of those future links from your chain. If you have a 2.5-year-old, they have a very powerful need for order. And if you say, okay, we're going to go to the grocery store now, zoop, and out you go. Invariably, your child's going to start screaming. Because what happened is you have given that child no warning that you've completely rocked her world. Right? She was in the middle of figuring out that dust ball on the floor. And that was very interesting. And now you've taken away from this very important scientific experiment that she had going on to go ahead and do the shopping thing. So what happens is the patience is to say half an hour before you go, Susie, we're going to be leaving in about half an hour to go to the grocery store. And then about 15 minutes before you go, Susie, remember we're going to the grocery store. And then about 5 minutes before you go, Susie, we're going to start getting rain, about 5 minutes to go to the grocery store. Those kinds of warnings requires a great amount of forethought from us as parents and patience from us as parents. But the benefit of it is that Susie has time to finish her dust ball experiment and be ready when you're ready to go ahead and get the coat on and go out the door. Okay? So it's an important thing to remember. So all of these things with the digital literacy skills are really about developing the skills that have nothing to do with technology, but developing the skills that will then prepare your child to be able to handle this new technological world out there that they're facing. Last one, and that's the career and life skills. And these are fairly simple. Being able to be flexible and adaptable. That's an important part. Be able to change plans, adapt to varied roles, because that's going to happen in business. We're not all going to have a precise job description. And in fact, because our managers are just as harried as we are, you may not even get a great job description. And you may have a lousy evaluation process because you need to be able to stand on your own a little bit more than you may have 20 years ago when they had this very lugubrious evaluation process that you went through. It may have been lugubrious, but you had a very clear sense of what your responsibilities were and where you were strong, where you were weak. That's less so nowadays because managers aren't there. A lot of that middle management is gone. And a lot of it is that they're not able to do as much of the evaluation as they once did. So what does that mean? That means that you need to be able to have those innovative and creative skills that we were talking about earlier. And you develop those by questioning back to the child, by giving them the opportunity to take a material like this in Montessori and devise their own way to the solution. Not telling them, dictating what the solution is. And again, that's a far cry from what we've had in 20th century education, where we dictate what the specific answer is. Here, they have to figure out their own way to get to the answer. Okay? Now, when I say that this is a material that you can see it breaks down and the child has to build it back up. In Montessori, we do all, you need to know that Montessorians are people who are a little bit sneaky, and I'll admit that. Because what happens, we put an autocorrect aspect to almost all the materials. So if you don't put this away in the right way, you can't fold the box back up at the end. It doesn't fold up orderly. And remember, this is designed for 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds. They want that sense of order. And we also build it very sturdily because we will have some 4-year-old boys pushing really hard to try to get it to fit in that box. And then they realize it doesn't and they have to come back and work through it again. And that's developing that sense of innovation, that sense of creativity. That's developing that flexibility and adaptability that they need. You also have to have initiative and self-direction in what you're doing, because you're not going to be working in that cubicle with a one specific thing anymore. You're going to be working with a different team, and you're going to have to figure out what your role is within that team. You have to have social and cross-cultural interactions, and that means you need to find out what your role is, what another person's role is in that activity, and you have to negotiate your way through that. That's getting back to that high emotional intelligence that I was talking about before. You need to have the ability to be productive and to be accountable. So you're not going to necessarily have someone looking right over your shoulder the whole time. You need to take ownership for yourself and your actions and be more accountable for your work. And that's going to be something that you're going to see in the 21st century. You're going to have kids who are more independent, more responsible. That's something we start inculcating into our kids at the age of 3, developing that sense of independence, that sense of self-discipline, that sense of accountability and responsibility for their actions. We do it through the materials that they're using. We also use it through the classroom environment. There's a great story, a gentleman who was the, what was he? He was the Secretary of Education for the state of California. He was talking at a conference I went to one time, and his son was in a Montessori school. and his son was a little bit rambunctious. And he came in to pick up his son one day, and he found him in the corner of the room. And the father was a little bit nervous, and he went to his son and said, "Did the teacher put you in the corner here? Were you bad?" He said, "No, I made a bad choice." We never call the child bad. We make good choices and bad choices, but we never call a child bad. He said, "I made a bad choice. And Susie and I decided that the best thing I needed was to go to someplace where I could be by myself. So I came over here to the corner." So there was a case where this little boy had already begun to have an understanding. This was a 4-year-old, I believe. Have an understanding of accountability for his actions. Susie was very clear in saying, "You don't do that in our classroom. You can't do that in our classroom." And that was something that helped him reinforce that sense of accountability for himself. And so he had put himself in a space. Now, it was a corner, and we all have images of, okay, if someone's in the corner, you know, that's a bad thing. But for him, it was a space away from everybody else where he could recollect himself. And that's part of what he was doing. Last one is leadership and responsibility. And this goes back to the high emotional intelligence, is the ability to be inspiring to others so that they'll follow, to be able to interact with other people and figure out what is an appropriate consensus of going forward, either as a project team or in other ways. That's pretty much it. Are there any questions? I hope I didn't bore all of you. Thank you so much for coming today. I hope this was very helpful to you. So, thank you.
Thank you.